Hello everyone, welcome to another Book Review Wednesday, and today I am going to be discussing Wuthering Heights, I believe is how you pronounce it, and this is by Emily Bronte. I'm not exactly sure. She's supposed to, I believe, be an English author, but for some reason her name sounds very French, or from some other European country. But basically, this is considered, I guess you could say, a classic among English literature. In particular, when you look at sort of the time period that it was produced, which was the 1800s, which was a very popular time for women writing. It seemed like women were coming out of the works and coming up with a lot of these very interesting stories. And this was one of them, along with other books like Pride and Prejudice, um, all these other female authors, and up on top there with those kinds of stories. Now, as far as what this story is about, without really giving too much away, basically the entire story is really told through Nellie Dean's perspective, and she is a housekeeper of this guy named Lockwood, and I believe it's Lockwood, and basically he, after visiting the Wuthering Heights estate, or I guess they could say the whole area there, he wants to kind of know more about sort of the history involved. And this is where really the story kind of takes off, is Nellie basically tells the entire story through her perspective and what she's witnessed at that location and the characters involved. So basically, it's explained that a man named Mr. Earnshaw is the owner of Wuthering Heights initially, and he ends up adopting this boy named Heathcliff. And Heathcliff initially is treated as an outcast, not only because he's an orphan, but I believe it's also presented that he is of a different kind of race. So that's also something else that kind of comes into play. As you would probably imagine within these really older type-esque stories. And although there is some initial sort of backlash towards him and sort of being part of the family, eventually Mr. Ershaw's daughter, Catherine, ends up growing very fond of him and eventually falls in love with him. But unfortunately, things get rather complicated when she ultimately ends up deciding to marry another man. And as a result, this deeply upsets Heathcliff, and eventually he ends up marrying another woman named Isabella. And this is really where the sort of drama ensues. I mean, this is really where it kind of starts to take off as a story. Because once you realize the initial conflict that occurs, it really propels into all of these different kinds of directions that really result from this fundamental choice that both of these characters made, deciding ultimately Catherine not deciding to marry Heathcliff, and Heathcliff deciding to just marry someone else in Catherine's place. And really this creates a lot of tension because you ultimately see how sort of these two kinds of families, like Catherine's family that she ends up developing, and Heathcliff's family, and how they end up developing, and how there's this real buildup of tension and animosity, bitterness, and And that's really the heart of the story. It's trying to kind of present, I guess you could say, I believe, uh, 18th century / 19th century kind of, drama. That's kind of this story in a broader perspective. And at least dramas, I have a little bit more class back then than, oh, let's say something like a Kim Kardashian, whose wedding lasted, 9 months or something like that. But the interesting thing, though, too, is that largely these characters aren't really all that likable, actually, I found. Although Heathcliff presents himself rather likable throughout the beginning, after Catherine's decision, he becomes almost a very different person, in the sense that he becomes very cruel and manipulative to some people, and he uses his kind of power and status to kind of take advantage of Catherine's family, and you'll see sort of how he does that if you choose to read the story. And Catherine is just kind of this very spoiled, self-absorbed woman, at least from what I could tell. I didn't think she was really all too considerate to Heathcliff's feelings. And this is clearly showcased when she really, kind of ultimately ends up deciding to marry another guy and kind of leads him pretty much on for a long, long time. So yeah, I think there is a lot of things that exist with the majority of the characters that do bother me. I guess you could say more so than I've seen within other classic English literature pieces. I kind of like, though, that it's told through Nellie's perspective. And although I think Nellie is not really that all of an interesting character, because again, I think she is just sort of a tool to kind of just show you the whole world of Wuthering Heights. She's not necessarily supposed to be the really standout character, and really in-depth character. She's just kind of there to show the story. She is probably the most likable out of everybody, although I will say that she's really not all that interesting, and I find her life to be rather dull compared to all the other people that surround her life, which you will see, because again, this book is told through largely her perspective. So, although I don't necessarily care too much for the characters, I really do like the plot and its ultimate progression, because I like kind of seeing the effects that end up impacting people's lives based upon the choices that they make. And it was clear that the choices that Catherine and Heathcliff, make are very poor choices, and as a result, they kind of end up being bitter and ultimately, I guess you could say, really lonely, and you sort of see how eventually they kind of self-destroy themselves by kind of not being together almost. It's kind of bizarre in how the novel chooses to approach it. But for the most part, it is primarily designed to kind of show you the impact that this powerful emotion that we call love ends up uh, doing, at least to people within this particular book. And I think it's also the character's lack of, trying to kind of move on and see the positivity in things that I think is also a contributing factor to kind of leading to their greater bitterness, their greater cynical nature. And I think that's really what is really the book's focus, because I think it's trying to be kind of cautionary in showing people that sometimes these kinds of things and these inner workings of relationships can have a really profound impact on people's lives. And sometimes people, at least I think a lot of the times nowadays, they like to shrug it off and pretend like there's nothing wrong, even though what they had happen to them was something that was very, very damaging to their, you know, maybe self-esteem or their whole uh, psychological well-being. And I think these characters primarily hid their real feelings and their and denied the happiness that would have been given to them had they made different choices. And they probably would have left also a lot of other people less miserable if they did. So again, it's kind of a it's kind of just trying to highlight those important concepts of choices and of love, and how um, tragedy can end up sort of resulting from, uh, you know, not ultimately making the right choices, and not considering other people's uh, feelings, or and how you can yourself become a more angered and more bitter person as a result of someone kind of putting damage onto you. So I think this is really the primary focus that this book takes. Um, a lot of it again has to do with family, but primarily love is at the center and forefront. And as probably most of everybody of the audience knows, you kind of have to start with love in order to have sort of a functional uh, family, I guess you could say. And you can clearly tell by the choices that they made that it brought a lot of dysfunctional uh, things by their choices, and as a result, a lot of other people around them end up kind of suffering. So I think that's really the main important thing to get and to understand about this story. And I think some people don't really, I think, get these kinds of books because some they're like, oh, they're so old in English, and I had to look a lot of stuff up in order to fully absorb what's going on, because I can understand that some people may not be interested in this kind of work because of the fact that it is written in this kind of very oldish style English. But I would still definitely recommend this book if you're interested in this kind of um, plot and sort of character setup. Um, and it is interesting. I think it has some interesting commentary onto things. Um, and I think it really points out a lot of things that really go hand in hand with social situations. And I think it did it actually in a very clever way. Although, yes, the main character, the one that's, we hear from her point of view or her side, she's really not that important. It's more about the character interactions that are the most important through this story. And I think that ultimately works. And I found it to be thoroughly an enjoyable read. Um, and as a result of that, and I didn't feel like other books that do try to kind of bring in some kind of drama, like for example Pride and Prejudice, where the two main characters are kind of the main focus, and they kind of tear each other down until eventually they fall in love, which I find just to be the most bizarre concept in the world. um, this book actually takes it through the opposite ends of the spectrum and says they initially had feelings that didn't get seen through, and you see the actual demise and that and the impact that that decision kind of makes and puts forth into motion. So ultimately, I think, though, that's really all I can say about this book. However, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care.